66-year-old Sharon Erickson loved being retired. And as the former assistant treasurer of Saunders County stepped out of her house on this cool Thursday morning in June of 2003, she thought, not for the first time, that one of her only regrets in life was that she hadn't retired a few years sooner. Now, turning to look up and down the tiny business district of Colon, Nebraska, one of the smallest towns in America, Sharon ran through her mental list of what she planned to do that early summer day. After spending 37 years collecting tax revenue and keeping perfect records of complicated financial transactions, the routines that Sharon had put in place over the last 5 years of her non-working life had given her the time and opportunity to pursue her own interests and hobbies. And even though getting her hair styled every Thursday afternoon was not exactly a hobby, it was one of the weekly appointments that Sharon looked forward to the most. Putting her hand up to her brown hair, Sharon patted the big puffy curls that had been her signature style for as long as she could remember. And since the hair salon where Sharon went every week to have her hair done was out in Cedar Falls, that meant an enjoyable 10-minute car ride due north to a town that was more than 4 times bigger than Colon, which clocked in with just 128 residents. For Sharon, the drive to Cedar Bluffs was also a trip down memory lane. This was where Sharon had gone to high school, the same high school where Sharon's mother had spent years of her teaching career. In addition to seeing some familiar sights and maybe grabbing a quick bite to eat, Sharon's weekly appointment was always a nice opportunity to chat with her hairdresser about what was going on in Saunders County, where both towns were located, and to exchange local news, personal stories, and opinions about everything from the weather to state and county politics. And after an hour of friendly conversation in which the women would feel like they had identified and probably solved most of the world's problems, Sharon could enjoy a stroll around the local farmer's market before she hopped back into her silver Taurus sedan and headed back home to 112 Spruce Street. Sharon knew that from the outside, this weekly visit to Cedar Bluffs, along with her other daily and weekly routines, might look unexciting and even boring, but to Sharon, who had been divorced for many years and who did not have any children, these routines represented all the ways in which she had become part of the social fabric of Colon, Nebraska, her home for the last 47 years. And it was this connection that had made Sharon's retirement meaningful. As the strongly built woman with bright blue eyes and big hair stepped into the post office right next to her home, she stopped long enough to say good morning to the postmaster, Rick Hartman, before walking over to her post office box to check for mail. Sharon was good friends with Rick. She had hired him to do various repairs and improvements to her house, and when Sharon was away on one of the trips she enjoyed taking with her cousin, who lived 40 minutes south in Lincoln, Sharon left her house key with Rick so he could keep his eye on the property while she was gone. The post office, always Sharon's first stop, was also a good place for Sharon to catch up with neighbors and local news. And even though Sharon had never been known as a person who meddled or pried into other people's business, all her years in customer service and all her years of handling bills and money had left Sharon with a keen eye for making sure that things in her own little hometown were running smoothly. Sharon had always been known at the Saunders County Treasurer's Office as a very honest and straightforward person who would not cheat her employer or taxpayers out of a single minute's worth of work. She was also known as someone who would not shy away from confronting someone if she thought they were doing something wrong or inappropriate. That was an attitude that Sharon had learned as the oldest of 3 children who'd been raised on a farm in Dodge, Nebraska, and who'd grown up taking care of land and livestock. In fact, here in Colon, there was a whole generation of 20-somethings who could remember Sharon calling them out when they were just children or teenagers if they got up to any trouble or mischief. And that no-nonsense attitude was also on display when it came to Sharon's prickly relationship with one of the long-distance truckers who sometimes parked his rig overnight on Colon's Main Street and left the engine running and the wheels of his truck partway on the sidewalk right in front of Sharon's home. As the postmaster, Rick, and everyone else in the tiny town knew, Sharon had an ongoing argument with the trucker, and, like everything else in Colon, disputes like that sparked plenty of satisfying gossip, and there was speculation that the trucker actually enjoyed riling up his strong-willed and outspoken critic. But except for her disagreements with this trucker, Sharon Erickson was one of the most popular and best-known residents of Colon. Even Sharon and her ex-husband, Robert Lee Erickson, had parted on good terms, and when their marriage ended, Robert had left 2 commercial properties to his ex-wife. And after the divorce, Sharon had converted Erickson Market, a little grocery store, into her private home, and on the lot across the street, she now had a garage where she kept her car. But it was what Sharon had done with part of the former grocery market that had won her a special place in the heart of her community. When the bar/cafe in Colon, where residents would all go to grab coffee and talk, closed down, Sharon had hired Rick, the postmaster, to remodel the front room of her home into a little community meeting place with tables and chairs and free coffee. And then Sharon handed out keys so Colon residents could come and go as they liked. And not only did Sharon offer free refreshments, she could also still help Colon residents out with questions or any problems related to their county tax bills. After chatting for a few minutes with Rick, Sharon waved goodbye to her friend and walked out of the post office to make her next stop at the local bank. Not only did Sharon keep her checking and savings account there, she and the bank employees had shared a common career in managing and keeping track of money, and so there was always common ground for discussion. Except now that Sharon was retired, she mostly just liked to talk about what vacations she might like to take with her cousin. Along with her skill as a dancer, who never missed the chance to twirl the night away with her local singles group, Sharon also loved outdoor activities like fishing and visiting her sister out in Colorado. By the time Sharon had arrived home late that afternoon from her trip to Cedar Bluffs, she was looking forward to the phone call that was always the final scheduled event of her day. After pulling her car into the small tan garage that was located across the street from her house, Sharon walked outside and used the remote to close the garage door. Then she turned and crossed Spruce Street to her red brick home with the big glass windows that faced onto the street. Although Sharon was not someone who scared easily, as a single woman living alone, she was very mindful of her personal safety. While she had welcomed the community into one of the front rooms of her house, that room was closed off from the rest of Sharon's house, and Sharon had made sure that her window coverings blocked any view from the street into or out of Sharon's living space. About a year and a half ago, Sharon was sure that while inside her house, she had seen one of her doorknobs turn, as though someone outside was checking quietly to see if the door was unlocked. In response, Sharon had immediately installed door alarms that were designed to go off in the event of any forced entry. Behind Sharon's house, there were only a handful of other residential buildings separated by a narrow alley from Sharon's own property. And about a half block away, there was also a small field containing long, round, white steel tanks filled with anhydrous ammonia. Anhydrous ammonia was one of the ingredients used to make fertilizer, but it was also one of the key ingredients that went into the illegal production of methamphetamine, the highly addictive and popular stimulant that in the last several years had driven up the rate of crime and health problems throughout the population in the rural Midwest. Concerned about the alleyway and about people trying to steal anhydrous ammonia from those tanks, Sharon had enclosed her own backyard by putting up a 6-foot-high chain-link fence, leaving just the back and side doors with access to her fenced-in backyard. Now, glancing at her watch, Sharon stepped up to her front door, turned the key, and let herself inside her cozy wood-paneled living room. Sharon was looking forward to changing into comfortable clothes, admiring her freshly styled hair, then settling into the soft brown armchair tucked into the corner next to a reading lamp. And then, at 5 p.m. sharp, Sharon would do what she did every day, chat on the telephone with her cousin in Lincoln. The two women, who enjoyed traveling together and who visited each other at least several times a week, had plans to get together that Sunday for lunch and a movie. After chatting for a few minutes, the two friends confirmed those plans and then ended the call. As for the rest of Sharon's day, it wouldn't be too long before Sharon made one quick circuit of her house and made sure all the doors were locked and she was buttoned up tight for the night. Not that Sharon expected any trouble. After all, if there was one person in Colon who knew all of her neighbors and practically everybody else in town, it was Sharon. To her, the little town of Colon was an open book, and a book with its ever-changing stories and secrets that Sharon never tired of reading. And besides, when it came to personal safety, Sharon had one more line of defense. Tucked inside the drawer of her nightstand, right next to Sharon's bed, was a small Beretta handgun. It wasn't until the evening of Monday, June 30th, 2003, that Sharon Erickson's cousin in Lincoln picked up the phone and dialed the number for the state bank in Colon, where Sharon did her banking. Sharon and her cousin had spent the previous day, Sunday, having lunch together and watching a movie. When Sharon had left Lincoln at 4:30 p.m. that Sunday afternoon, the two friends had said goodbye and promised to talk again the next day, Monday, at the usual time, 5 p.m. But it was now nearly 6 p.m. on Monday, and Sharon was not picking up her phone, despite her cousin calling her over and over again. And Sharon's cousin could just not keep the concern out of her voice when she asked if anyone at the bank could just walk 2 doors down the street to Sharon's house and just make sure Sharon was okay. In a town as small as Colon, where residents were used to looking out for one another, this was not an unusual request. But even though 2 bank employees immediately made arrangements to step away from their workstations to go check on Sharon, given how little crime there was in this tiny town, they were not really that worried. All that changed when the 2 women reached the front door of Sharon's house and saw an unread morning newspaper lying inside the screen door. Along with the folded newspaper was a delivery of frozen food with a sticker indicating it had been left there at about 1 p.m. and a note, "Sorry I missed you," that suggested Sharon had not answered the delivery person's knock on the door. Even as their own knocks went unanswered, the 2 women from the bank were suddenly aware of the sound of a door alarm going off in the side or the back of the house. A minute later, and the women had called Sharon's friend and Colon's postmaster, Rick Hartman. Together, the 3 of them entered the unlocked front door to Sharon's house, their sense of neighborly concern quickly turning to worry and dread. One look into Sharon's empty bedroom, and that worry turned to fear. Sharon's bed was unmade, and on top of her nightstand, Rick saw an empty gun holster. The only other place left to search for their missing neighbor was Sharon's garage across the street. Grabbing the extra remote from its hook near the front door, it was only moments before Sharon's friends were watching the garage door slowly roll upward to reveal Sharon's silver Taurus. And there, right next to the car, lay the blood-spattered body of its owner, 66-year-old Sharon Erickson. And next to her body lay a small black Beretta pistol. By 7 p.m. on the evening of that Monday, June 30th, a little over 24 hours after Sharon had arrived home from her Sunday afternoon visit with her cousin in Lincoln, the street outside Sharon's home and garage was filled with flashing lights as sheriff deputies and medical personnel responded to the 911 call that Rick had made about 15 minutes earlier at 6:42 p.m. And right from the very start of the investigation into what had happened inside that garage, the town's postmaster did not hold back when it came to offering law enforcement his personal theories and observations. Even before the yellow crime scene tape was strung up around the perimeter of both properties, Rick Hartman was explaining to police that Sharon must have used the handgun that was found on the floor of the garage to commit suicide. Repeatedly ducking back under the crime scene tape to join officers clustered around Sharon's body, the postmaster would back up his theory by pointing out the fact that Sharon's own father had ended his life with a self-inflicted gunshot wound to the head back when Sharon was just 23 years old. But even a very quick examination of Sharon's body, laying face up on the floor and parallel to her car, was enough for investigators to rule out suicide. Because not only was the Beretta unloaded and showing no signs of having been recently fired, there was also a bloody footprint on the floor that did not belong to Sharon. And after visually inspecting the injuries to Sharon's body, it looked to police like whoever else had been in that garage hadn't shot Sharon. Instead, they had delivered a long and savage beating to one of Colon's best-known residents. Meanwhile, deputies who had done a sweep of Sharon's house across from the garage reported back that the phone line to Sharon's house had been cut. It also appeared that an intruder had climbed over Sharon's 6-foot-high fence and then used a chisel to break into Sharon's house through the side door, setting off the door alarms as well as the motion sensor alarms in the backyard. And even though Sharon's security system seemed to have worked, the actual alarms had not been loud enough for any of Sharon's neighbors to notice that Sharon's house had been broken into. Even as the Saunders County Sheriff's Department put out the call for assistance in the case to the Nebraska State Patrol, investigators on the scene noticed one more chilling detail about the crime scene. The shirt Sharon was wearing had been pulled up and her underwear was exposed. It now appeared likely that the first homicide in Colon in more than 40 years might also include a sexual assault. Within hours of discovering Sharon's body, crime techs were busy collecting and processing physical evidence from the house and garage on Spruce Street, and police had already begun fanning out around the tiny town of Colon to see if anyone heard or saw anything suspicious that might be connected to the murder. But wherever state and local police went, it seemed like the terrified residents of Colon had already heard about the brutal attack, and the town was already swirling with rumors and speculation. Was the killer someone Sharon knew, or a random stranger passing through town? Was this a burglary gone wrong? Was the murder somehow connected to Sharon's past and to her work at the county treasurer's office? And at the center of all the speculation, residents were asking themselves, what was it about Sharon Erickson that they didn't know? By Tuesday, July 1st, the day after Sharon had been killed, there was already one name at the top of investigators' list of possible suspects: Colon's postmaster and volunteer firefighter, Rick Hartman. In the absence of a husband or romantic partner who might have had a personal motive for killing Sharon, Rick appeared to be an exceptionally close friend of Sharon's, someone Sharon had entrusted with a key to her house, and someone who had helped her with improvements to her property. Rick had also drawn suspicion to himself with his intense interest in what police were thinking and doing, and by repeatedly showing up near and even inside the marked-off crime scene areas. At the same time that police began to have conversations with Rick about his movements in the days leading up to Sharon's murder, investigators were also following up on another possible theory that Sharon's murder had been the result of a robbery gone wrong. Even though nothing of value seemed to be missing from Sharon's house, investigators were looking at the possibility that the break-in had awakened Sharon, who then confronted the robber with her unloaded pistol before fleeing from her house to the safety of her garage and the cell phone she kept inside her car. It was there that Sharon had been attacked and killed. But it wasn't long before both theories, Rick as murderer and robbery gone wrong, seemed to hit a dead end. Rick's wife and family confirmed his alibi for the likely time of Sharon's death. As for the robbery, the only person in town with a history of criminal offenses was a 24-year-old man who lived with his mother in a house across the alley behind Sharon's house. But like Rick, James Mars also had an alibi for the time of the murder. He'd been out drinking with friends in the neighboring town of Wahoo before arriving back home, checking in with his mother, who was asleep on the couch, watching TV, and then going to sleep in his bedroom. Like everyone else in Colon who police would interview over the next 2 weeks, James knew Sharon, but his only real contact with her had been when he was much younger and would sometimes pick up a few dollars, helping her with yard work or shoveling her snow. Meanwhile, the autopsy report on Sharon's body, which was released to police 7 days after her murder, had confirmed police suspicions that Sharon had been sexually assaulted before she was killed. Unfortunately, the DNA samples that the medical examiner had collected from Sharon's body and clothing were not large enough to produce a DNA analysis definitive enough that police could use it to identify a possible killer. Police also came up short on other physical evidence. It appeared that the killer had not left any fingerprints or any trace of his own blood or tissue either inside Sharon's house or garage, or on the unfired gun that was found near Sharon's body. With James Mars and Rick Hartman on the back burner as suspects in this case, police turned their attention to 2 other possible leads. After hearing about the arguments that Sharon had had with the trucker who sometimes stopped over in Colon, investigators hopped into their service vehicles and drove throughout Saunders County, asking at gas stations and truck stops about a man with a red rig that had an eagle on its front license plate. At the same time, investigators were spending hours tracking down any possible link between Sharon's death and the drug trade. specifically whether Sharon might have been killed because she witnessed someone stealing anhydrous ammonia, the key ingredient in meth, from the tanks located half a block from her house. But almost 3 weeks after Sharon's murder, both of those leads had dried up too. That's when the trucker, unaware that there was an all-points bulletin out for him and his rig, passed through Colon again. But when he was stopped and questioned by investigators, the trucker presented gas and travel receipts that showed he'd been out of state at the time of Sharon's murder. By then, investigators had also failed to turn up any connection between Sharon's murder and the operators of any local meth labs. By late July, almost 7 weeks after Sharon's murder, state and local investigators were no closer to finding Sharon's killer than they had been on the evening her body had been found sprawled out on the floor of her garage. And even as the residents of Colon were becoming more and more desperate for answers, the only thing detectives had left to do in a case that was quickly starting to go cold was to send the DNA evidence collected from Sharon's body and clothing to the crime lab at the Nebraska State University Medical Center for more advanced and sophisticated testing. Investigators also circled back to Colon's postmaster, Rick Hartman, raising the possibility that his alibi was not so solid after all. And as the cornfields surrounding Colon, Nebraska ripened over the course of that hot Midwestern summer, the rumor mill inside the little town had also heated up. And at the center of the gossip over Sharon's murder was speculation that Rick and Sharon had been having an affair that had somehow ended with Sharon's violent assault and death. And in October 2003, 4 months after Sharon's murder, investigators got a tip that put Rick right back in the #1 position on detectives' list of suspects. At a recent garage sale of Sharon's furniture and other belongings, Rick had made what police viewed as a strange and suspicious purchase. Colon's postmaster showed up at the estate sale and bought Sharon's mattress. When Sharon's sister had confirmed that sale to investigators, their first thought was that maybe Rick wanted to get rid of the mattress because it contained traces of his own DNA that could link him to Sharon and to her murder. After again denying any involvement and explaining that he bought the mattress for use in his family's spare bedroom, Rick finally agreed to provide police with his fingerprints and hair samples. He also agreed to take a polygraph test, but the results of that test were inconclusive. Still, with no hard evidence that linked Rick to the crime, investigators had to let Rick go and admit, at least for the time being, that their investigation into Sharon's murder had ground to a halt. It would be another 6 months after that interview and 10 months after the discovery of Sharon's body before investigators finally got the breakthrough in the Sharon Erickson homicide that they'd been hoping for. In April of 2004, detectives received a call from the Nebraska State Crime Lab. Using a single sperm cell they had found on Sharon's clothing, scientists at the state lab had been able to isolate a complete DNA profile of Sharon's presumed killer. And to the shock of everyone who had been involved in the investigation, that profile did not match the DNA submitted by the detective's #1 suspect, Rick Hartman. Still, the new evidence breathed life and hope back into the Sharon Erickson homicide investigation, and soon detectives were once again poring over every one of the 200 interviews and 500 pages that made up the case file to see if there was anything they might have missed back in the summer of 2003. And within days, police had launched a DNA dragnet, spreading out across Colon and other areas of Saunders County to collect DNA samples from people whose names they had found listed in previous interviews, and sending each of those samples straight back to the Nebraska University Crime Lab. And just 3 weeks later, by the end of April 2004, 10 months to the day after Sharon's murder, investigators got another call from the crime lab. One of the DNA samples they had just tested was a perfect match to the killer who had left their DNA on Sharon's clothing. For the 128 residents of Colon, the name on that report would change everything they thought they knew about each other. And for years to come, Sharon's beloved hometown would become a place where people locked their doors, looked over their shoulders, and questioned the basic goodness of human nature. Based on what investigators would discover from a review of Sharon's murder file, coupled with that DNA evidence, here is a reconstruction of what police believe happened to Sharon Erickson in the early morning hours of June 30th, 2003. On the afternoon of Sunday, June 29th, while Sharon was spending the day with her cousin in Lincoln, Sharon's killer was also spending the day with their family. But unlike Sharon, whose golden years of retirement had capped a long and successful life of hard work and close friendships, on that particular day, the killer's feeling of everything going wrong in his life seemed to get worse with every passing hour. And by 1:45 a.m. on the morning of Monday, June 30th, the killer found himself standing outside the 6-foot-high fence that encircled the backyard that belonged to Sharon Erickson, a single older woman who appeared to have at least one thing the killer really needed, and that was money. But over the last few hours, the killer had gone from feeling depressed about his life to feeling both angry and excited, like he was finally capable of taking steps that would change things for the better. Looking at the fence, the killer felt like he could easily climb over a barrier that was twice as high, and he didn't need a weapon to make his plan work. He'd already cut the telephone line, and all he needed now was the chisel inside his pocket that he could use to get inside that treasure box of a house. And just a minute or two later, the killer was dropping quietly onto the grass of the backyard and heading to the narrow space between the fence and the side door. And as he did this, the motion detector lights in the backyard switched on. And as soon as the killer had pried loose the door and then used his boot to kick the door open so he could slip inside, he began to hear the sound of the door alarm going off inside the house. The staccato bleat of that alarm was loud enough to wake Sharon from a sound sleep. Sitting up in bed, Sharon immediately understood that alarms were going off, and so she reached for the phone on top of her nightstand. Even before she had put the receiver to her ear, she had punched in 911. But instead of hearing the police operator at the other end of the telephone line, all Sharon heard was silence, no matter how many times she kept punching in those 3 emergency numbers. Dropping the phone and switching on her bedside lamp, Sharon jumped out of her bed, opened the drawer of the nightstand, and pulled out the holster where she kept her pistol. Even though the gun was not loaded, the Beretta felt solid and heavy in Sharon's hand. Dropping the holster onto the tumbled sheets, Sharon wrapped both of her hands around the grip of the gun, and when the intruder stepped inside her bedroom a moment later, Sharon was there waiting, gun pointed straight at his chest. But as soon as Sharon saw the face of her intruder, her eyes widened and the gun dropped a few inches as a burst of anger ran through Sharon's body. Yelling at the man in front of her to get out of her house, to leave and never come back, Sharon stepped forward to close the distance between them. Faced with Sharon's fury and looking down the barrel of a Beretta pistol, the intruder backed up, tried to get his bearings, and tried to remember that feeling of power that had surged through him when he had swung his body over Sharon's fence and kicked her door in just a few minutes ago. But the last thing he had expected when he entered Sharon's house was this show of anger and defiance, and this voice that put into words all of his failings and mistakes. Pivoting suddenly, the killer made for the door. It turned out there was nothing worth stealing in this house anyway, and now he just had to get away. But even as the killer slipped outside and headed for the empty street, he could hear Sharon's footsteps behind him. Dropping back into the shadows, the killer watched as Sharon, dressed, carrying her purse, wearing her slippers, gun in hand, came running out the front door and headed for her tan garage 50 yards away, already clicking the remote that opened the garage door. And suddenly, the killer understood what Sharon was about to do. She must have a cell phone inside her car, and she was going to call the police, tell them who he was and what had just happened. Sprinting out from the shadows, the killer raced after Sharon and made it into the garage right behind her even as the garage door was starting to roll back down. According to the autopsy that would be conducted on Sharon's body 36 hours later, the medical examiner would determine that the actual cause of Sharon's death was strangulation. But that came after a beating that would leave Sharon with severe blunt force trauma to the left side of her head, nose, and her left eye. Defensive wounds all along the left side of her body, along with cuts and bruising to her face, arms, and legs, all indicated that Sharon had struggled against her attacker with all of her strength. But all of Sharon's strength and all of her will to live would not be enough to save her. Before the attack in that garage was over, Sharon's killer, a man Sharon had known since he was a small child, sexually assaulted the 66-year-old retiree who had spent most of her life helping other people. Finally, Sharon's killer unwrapped his hands from around Sharon's throat. But when he looked down at his victim, Sharon's killer was shocked to find that Sharon was still alive. Exhausted, 24-year-old James Mars, who had been one of the teenagers Sharon had once scolded for getting into mischief, climbed to his feet. Stepping onto Sharon's chest and neck, he could feel her ribs and the bones in her neck start to break under the weight of his boots. He literally stamped the life out of his victim. It would turn out the alibi James Mars had given investigators back in July of 2003, about 11 days after Sharon was discovered, was riddled with lies. After spending the afternoon of Sunday, June 29th, just across the state border in Kansas, helping his aunt put a new roof on her house, James headed back into Nebraska to drink beer at one of his friends' houses. But by 12:30 a.m. on Monday morning, June 30th, James and at least one friend had gone to a local bar where they continued to drink for another half hour or so until they moved to a second bar called the Oasis. But they arrived at the Oasis right as the bar had stopped serving alcohol. And after the bartender refused to serve James another drink, James decided to experiment with a new kind of stimulant. And for the first time in his life, James tried cocaine. Too drunk and high to drive back to Colon using the main roads where he might be stopped by police, James left the bar nearly an hour earlier than he had told police, arriving back at his mother's house not at 2:30 a.m., but at 1:30 a.m. After digging into James's alibi, police would discover that one of James's friends had agreed to lie about when James left the bar, and James's mother may only have been guessing at what time James had actually arrived home. But one thing is certain, James did not just go straight to bed after watching a few minutes of TV in his mother's living room. Instead, by 1:45 a.m., riding a cocaine and alcohol high, James had decided that he could at least solve one problem in his life, the fact that he was flat broke, by robbing his neighbor who lived just across the alley that separated their two houses. James figured that Sharon, older and single, would be an easy target. Instead, as soon as Sharon had recognized who her intruder was, she confronted him in the same way she had when he was a teenager, asking what he thought he was doing and telling him to get out of her house. But after doing exactly as he was told, James saw Sharon make a run to her garage, and the thought of her calling police and getting him arrested, along with everything else that was wrong in his life, like the fight he'd just had earlier that night with his longtime girlfriend, his young daughter who didn't live with him, the string of part-time farm work rather than any steady job, all caused James Mars to snap. As he said to investigators when he later confessed to Sharon's murder, quote, "I blew my cork," end quote. It wasn't until April 16, 2004, 10 months after Sharon's murder, and 6 months after James had moved out of Colon to Lincoln, Nebraska, that detectives located James, re-interviewed him, and requested a DNA swab, which he agreed to give them. 13 days later, on April 29th, James's DNA came back as a complete match to the sperm cell that was found on Sharon's clothing. 5 days later, on May 4th, 2004, James Mars was arrested and charged with first-degree murder. 3 months later, in August of 2005, James Mars avoided a jury trial by pleading guilty to a lesser charge of second-degree murder that he believed would come with a maximum sentence of 20 years in prison. Instead, in January of 2006, 3 years and 6 months after killing his next-door neighbor, James was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Explaining the severity of the sentence, the judge told James, quote, "Nothing I can say or do to you today can repair what your actions have done. You've taken a loved one, terrorized your community, and placed residents under a cloud of fear and suspicion." End quote. In 1990, 31-year-old John O'Brien was a landscaper in a town just outside of Chicago, Illinois. In January of that year, he and his friend David decided they wanted to escape the cold Chicago winter and go on some vacation to somewhere nice and warm. And so they decided to book a trip to the very sunny Caribbean islands of Trinidad and Tobago. They left for their trip just a couple of days later, which was believed to be January 8th or January 9th, and the hotel they were staying in was right near the airport in Trinidad. So they land in Trinidad, they get off their plane, they make their way out of the airport, they go to their hotel, they drop their luggage, and then they headed out to explore the town. And over the next couple of days, they not only explored Trinidad, but also the island of Tobago, which was a 4-hour boat ride away. And they had great food, they saw some really cool attractions, and just overall, they had a chance to relax in the warm weather while all their friends back home were freezing in Chicago. And so, by all accounts, their vacation was going exactly to plan until Sunday, the 14th of January. This was the day before they were supposed to fly back to Chicago. That day, John began complaining of some unnamed health issue, which has not been made public, so we don't know what it is. And he went to some drugstore in town in Trinidad to look for a specific medication for this unnamed health issue. But the drugstore did not carry this medication, so John left and he went to another drugstore and another store, but nobody had this medication. And so by the time John got back to the hotel and saw David, David would later remark that John was not only distraught about not having this medication, but John was disoriented. Like whatever this health issue was, it was starting to manifest itself in this kind of disoriented state that John was in because it was not being treated. But eventually, David decided that John was okay enough that they did not need to call a hospital or call a doctor, and the two men decided to just go to bed, because after all, they had a very early flight the next morning. So the two men climb into their respective beds, which are in the same room, 2 twin-size beds, and they fall asleep. But about an hour to maybe an hour and a half after David had fallen asleep, he wakes up to some man standing next to his bed, choking him. He's grabbing his throat and throttling him. And so David has no time to respond to what's going on. He just starts grabbing this guy's hands and he manages to push them off of him. And then this guy who's standing next to his bed grabs the lamp next to him and smashes David with it. David, from getting hit, falls out of the bed, he lands on the ground, and this guy, his attacker, jumps on top of him, and the two men are fighting, but eventually, David manages to overpower this guy, and he kicks him off. And as soon as he does that, he realizes this guy that's been attacking him is John, and John is completely naked. He's got no clothes on. And so John just stands up and David's looking at him like, what's going on? And John just runs out of the hotel room. He ends up running down the hall. He goes down the stairs. He runs past the front desk, out the front doors of the hotel, and just takes off running. And so John runs for several minutes until he reaches the airport. But instead of going through the front gates, he goes to the side of the front gates where there are these huge chain link fences with barbed wire at the top. And John, again, wearing no clothes, climbs up the chain link fence and then manages to navigate the barbs at the top and drops over onto the other side. But where he landed, although it was on airport property, it was kind of like a trap because this airport had 2 fences around its perimeter back to back. And so where John landed was like this grassy no man's land between these 2 fences. But John was on this kind of deranged mission, so he stands up and instead of trying to get back out again, he turns and climbs the next fence, the one that is closer to the airport. And so he climbs up this fence, he manages to get past all the barbed wire at the top, and he drops into the parking lot on the other side. He stands up and just continues running towards the main building of the airport. But between him and the main building of this airport is this huge concrete wall that doesn't look like it has any place to grab onto to climb over it. But John runs up to this wall and manages to climb up and over the wall. And where he landed on the other side was right next to this security guard shack. And so he comes crashing down, and the 4 security guards that are in this shack, they see him come over the wall. They see this naked guy just suddenly appear. And so they charge out to apprehend him and figure out what's going on. But John apparently attacked them. We don't know exactly what he did, but he managed to overpower all 4 of them, and he stole their 4-wheel drive vehicle. And so John just bombs away from the security guard shack with the 4 security guards chasing him on foot. And John, he weaves around the outside of the main airport building, and he heads out onto the tarmac. Out on the tarmac, there were several planes that were moving into position for takeoff, One of those planes was this huge British Airways jet airliner passenger plane that was actually the next to take off. They'd already fired up their engines, and they were sitting at the top of the runway just waiting for clearance. And John just drives directly into this plane. But the vehicle he was driving, this little four-wheel drive vehicle, it was not tall enough to actually strike the main body of this plane. So instead, when he hit this plane, he basically got wedged underneath one of the wings. At this point, the 4 security guards that had been attacked and had their vehicle stolen from them, they're running towards the tarmac, but they've also alerted other security personnel in the airport who are all streaming out onto the tarmac towards this British Airways plane and this vehicle and John. And so as they are descending on the scene, the security guards would see John from the passenger seat of this four-wheel drive vehicle. He stands up and they can see he's got a pretty nasty cut on his shoulder. And John reaches up and starts rubbing his hand on the underside of the plane, which had been damaged from running into it. And there was oil leaking off the underside of this plane. And John began rubbing this oil around and then dabbing it into his big wound on his shoulder. And then after packing it with this oil, John leapt out of the wrecked four-wheel drive vehicle and then just took off running away from all these security guards and away from this plane. And in the chaos of this moment, all these security guards and all the airport personnel that were descending on this scene, they managed to lose sight of John. He disappeared on the backside of this plane. And so all these security guards and airport personnel, they come to a stop about 100 feet away from this plane and this wrecked vehicle. And they're just kind of staring at it, wondering, what are we going to do next? They're calling other agencies to come in and assist with this situation when all of a sudden somebody notices John about 300 feet away on the other side of the plane. He comes out from behind a building. And so he's running towards the plane. He's running towards this wall of security guards and other airport staff. And John, he manages to get all the way up to the plane before anybody can come up and apprehend him. And when he reaches the plane, he stops for a second, looks up at the engine of this airplane that's still spinning. It's been turned on, and John jumps into the engine. And instantaneously, John ceases to exist. He is completely decimated. No one knows for sure what actually caused John's rampage, although it's assumed it had to do with whatever this unnamed health issue was. Ultimately, his death was ruled a suicide. Our next story is called Diuretic. On April 17th, 2018, 42-year-old Holly Mackey sat down in aisle seat 14C on a Southwest Airlines plane. That morning, she, along with 143 other passengers and the 5 crew members, would be flying from New York City to Dallas, Texas. And then after that 4-hour flight, Holly would get off that plane and board another plane from Dallas to Oklahoma City, where she lived. But luckily, that flight was only about an hour long. After Holly buckled her lap belt, she put her carry-on bag under the seat in front of her, and then she waited to see who was going to be sitting in the 2 seats to her left. A few seconds later, a 43-year-old bank executive and mother of 2 named Jennifer Reardon came walking down the aisle and stopped right outside of row 14 and turned into the aisle towards Holly. And Holly, who was kind of keeping her head down, she noticed there was this person standing outside of her aisle. And so she turned and looked up, and looking down at her was this big, bright smile. And Jennifer said to her, "Hey, can I sit next to you? Is anybody using those seats?" And Holly would say, "Nope, I'm here by myself. Go right ahead." Unlike other airlines that would assign seats to all of their passengers before they boarded, Southwest Airlines has an open seating plan. What they do is they basically group passengers into boarding groups, but then once that group is on the plane, it's first come, first serve. After Jennifer slid past Holly and made her way to the window seat where she sat down, which was seat 14A, she buckled her lap belt, and then just like Holly, she took her carry-on bag and stuffed it under the seat in front of her, and then she pulled a paperback book out of her bag and started reading it. For the next few minutes, as more and more passengers came onto the plane, nobody took the seat between Holly and Jennifer, because generally speaking, people don't like riding in the middle seat if there is a window or aisle seat available, because it's just not very comfortable sitting between 2 people for hours at a time. But eventually, the only seats left were middle seats. And at some point, this preteen girl who had her head buried in her phone, she comes onto the plane and she works her way down and she stops outside of row 14 and she very politely asks Holly if she can sit between her and Jennifer. And Holly says, absolutely. And so this girl slips past Holly and she sits down in seat 14B. She puts her lap belt on, she takes her carry-on, puts it under the seat in front of her, and then she just goes back to looking at her phone. Now that all of Holly's seatmates had arrived and she would not need to be getting out of the way for more people to come into a row, Holly kind of relaxed for a minute and she pulled out her iPad and she began scanning through the news as she waited for the plane to finish boarding. After all the passengers had been seated, one of the flight attendants closed the airplane door, and then they grabbed the microphone and welcomed everyone aboard the plane and thanked them for choosing Southwest Airlines. And then they reminded everyone on board to make sure their seatbelt was fastened, that their tray was in the upright position, that their seat was upright as well, that they'd stowed big electronics. And then with the help of several other flight attendants, they went over some basic safety procedures in case of a mid-air emergency. Most of the passengers on this flight were really not paying attention to the safety brief. They were trying to sleep, or they were stowing their stuff, or they were sending one last text message. But Holly, on the other hand, she was paying careful attention. Now, this wasn't totally unusual for her. She was generally safety conscious, but for some reason on this flight, she just had a sense that something bad was about to happen. There was this deep sense of foreboding that she normally didn't feel on flights. And so she found herself really carefully paying attention to these procedures in case something did go wrong. After the brief was over, the attendant who was holding the microphone thanked everyone for listening and then said, sit back, relax, and enjoy your flight. But Holly couldn't do that because, one, she really did have this weird sense that something was off about this flight, that something bad was going to happen, and she just didn't know why. And then number two, she remembered that she had drank this huge cup of iced coffee before she boarded the plane, and so now she really had to use the bathroom. But the plane had already begun taxiing over to the runway, and an attendant had told her she had to sit down. You can't go to the bathroom now. You gotta wait until we're up in the air. And so Holly, who was now feeling very mentally and physically uncomfortable, found herself kind of anxiously looking to her left out the window as the plane continued to taxi to the top of the runway. And then once the plane was set, it paused for a second, and then the engines fired, and Holly and the girl next to her and Jennifer all got sucked back into their seat as the plane began hurtling down the track. And so Holly, the girl, and Jennifer, they're all turned, they're looking out the window as the plane is just bombing straight ahead. They're watching the airport kind of disappear out of view, and then they feel the plane begin to get lift, and then they take off. As the plane rapidly ascended, Holly turned away from the window and just sat back and closed her eyes and was just picturing that moment when they reached their cruising altitude and she would hear that chime in the cabin, and then the captain would come on the intercom and say, we've reached our cruising altitude. It's now safe to get up and walk around, at which point Holly was going to run to the bathroom. And so when the plane finally got to a point where Holly felt like they were starting to level out, they probably were going to be at their cruising altitude soon, Holly preemptively undid her seatbelt and turned to face the aisle, getting ready for that chime in the cabin so she could get to the bathroom as soon as possible. But that chime didn't happen. Instead, when they reached their cruising altitude, the captain came on the intercom and she would tell everyone that they had reached their cruising altitude, but no one can leave their seats yet. They were expecting some fairly rough air, some turbulence. And so Holly was totally frustrated and disappointed, and she let out this audible grunt out of frustration. And Jennifer, who had her head in her book, she hears this grunt, and she turns to look at Holly to make sure she's okay. And at the exact same time, Holly found herself kind of looking down and turning towards the window to look out the window, and she made eye contact with Jennifer. And immediately Holly recognized that Jennifer thought something was wrong with her, and she was kind of looking at her to make sure she was okay. And Holly just goes, I really have to go to the bathroom. And so at this, the two women kind of laughed about Holly's plight because it was kind of funny that she desperately needed to go, but wasn't allowed to. And so eventually Jennifer just said, I'm sure they'll let you go soon. And then Jennifer went back to her book, and Holly went back to anxiously waiting to use the bathroom. And the girl sitting between them did not care at all. She was not listening to them. She didn't care. She had her head buried in her phone. After several minutes, Holly started to worry that it might be a while before she was allowed to get up and move around, because she's looking at the flight attendants and they're all buckled into their jump seats and they were hitting some turbulence. And so Holly's thinking, okay, I got to do something to take my mind off of this discomfort. Not only the physical discomfort of needing to use the bathroom, but also that strange foreboding. It just was not going away, and she didn't know what it was, but she just had the sense that something bad was going to happen. And so Holly decided she would do some work. And so at 11:04 a.m. Eastern, she reached down below the seat in front of her and began fishing around in her bag for her laptop. Before she could grab it, she heard two deafeningly loud sounds in rapid succession. The first was a popping sound that came from outside of the plane near the left wing. And the left wing was right outside of their window. And then she heard this whooshing sound that went through the entire cabin. It was like a high-powered vacuum. And then the entire cabin became freezing cold as the plane banked hard to the left. After all this happened, in this fraction of a second, Holly sat up, and it was like she was immediately in shock. She's looking out across the other seats, and she sees all those oxygen masks have deployed from the ceiling. People are screaming, the attendants are running up and down the aisle trying to help people put their masks on as the plane is hard banking to the left. And Holly just kind of robotically reaches out and grabs the mask right in front of her, and she tries to put it on, but despite having listened intently to the safety brief, it was like her hands didn't work, and she couldn't get the band to extend long enough to put it over her head. And so she's fumbling with this mask, still in shock. She can't believe this is actually happening. This is how she's gonna die. And then it's like she snaps out of it, and she forgets about the mask, and she turns left to make sure the girl and Jennifer were okay. And what she saw was absolutely horrifying. That popping sound she heard outside of the plane was the sound of the engine underneath the left wing exploding. And when it detonated, the cowling, which is the outside of the engine, it kind of protects the engine, it broke apart. And one of the pieces of this cowling flew and hit the side of the aircraft, and it struck the window of row 14, Holly's row. And when it did that, it shattered the window completely, causing an explosive decompression of the cabin. When even a small hole opens up in a plane flying miles above the earth, that hole will create hurricane-like forces inside of the cabin, and so anything that is not completely anchored down, including people, will get sucked out of that hole. And in this case, that's what happened. When that window broke open, Jennifer, who was sitting closest to it, was immediately sucked through the window. Now, she was not completely ejected because her seatbelt kept her from going completely out the window, but her entire upper half was now wedged outside of the plane. As for the girl sitting next to Jennifer, in between Jennifer and Holly, she was still getting pulled towards the window because Jennifer, even though she had been pulled out, there was still segments of the window that were open. And so there was still suction towards the window. And so Holly instinctively reached over and grabbed this girl and pulled her in tight to her chest. And then with her left arm, she reached behind the girl and grabbed the belt of Jennifer. And she tried to pull Jennifer back into the plane, but she could tell there was no way she could pull her back. The forces pulling Jennifer out of the plane were far too strong. Holly remembers thinking, someone is going to know this is happening. There's got to be a sensor or something. The flight crew has got to be aware that a person is getting pulled out of the plane. But in reality, the captain and the flight crew, they were aware that the left engine had blown up. That was the thing they were actively trying to combat, to try to keep the plane from crashing. But they had no idea about the drama that was unfolding in row 14. And so Holly is holding on to Jennifer, she's holding on to this girl, and she's screaming out for anybody in the plane to please take notice of the fact that Jennifer is stuck out of the plane. But the sound that was being created by this open window was deafening. Nobody could hear anybody else in this plane. Not to mention, the plane is banking hard to the left, and everybody on board believes they're about to die. So no one is looking around, taking stock of what's going on and assessing what to do next. Everybody's in survival mode and is basically just focused on themselves. And so despite Holly yelling out and trying to wave to people, it was worthless. Jennifer was just stuck out the window and no help was coming. And so for several minutes, Holly is just holding on to Jennifer. She's holding on to this girl. She's screaming out for help, but no one's hearing her. And then eventually, as the plane began to come back from its bank, and it seemed like the pilot was taking control of the craft, even though it was deafening inside and it was still terrifying, people began to open up their blinders a little bit and they started to look around, and some people sitting in the vicinity of row 14, they noticed what was going on with Jennifer and they began yelling and waving for the flight attendants. But again, the sound from this window was deafening. There was just no way the attendants could hear them. And even though everyone's waving at the attendants are very preoccupied. They're dealing with the people right in front of them who are all very worried and concerned. They're trying to talk to the captain about what they need to do next. And so they did not see there was this emergency happening. And so for several more minutes, Jennifer is just stuck out the window with nobody helping her. And it was during this time, as Holly is holding on to her waist and she's holding on to the girl, that Holly is thinking, Jennifer, she's been stuck outside the plane where there's no oxygen for almost 10 minutes. Nobody can survive that. And Jennifer's been forced through this window that's not big enough to have a person fit through it. And so Holly found herself moving her left hand that was gripping onto Jennifer's waist. She just let go of it, not because she was trying to let go of Jennifer. Frankly, her hand was not keeping Jennifer from going anywhere. It was just kind of habitual that she was holding on to her waist. So she takes her hand off of her waist and she just places it right in the center of Jennifer's back. Like she was comforting Jennifer. She was showing Jennifer that you're not alone. We can't help you, but you're not alone. And the woman in row 15, an older woman, she saw Holly do this and she reached across and she put her hand on Holly's back. It was like everybody knew this is a total crisis, but there's just nothing we can do, even if it's killing Jennifer. Despite the damage to the left engine from it exploding, the captain, Tammy Jo Schultz, who was a longtime veteran of the airline, she was able to combat this hard bank to the left, and she regained control of the plane, at which point, through the intercom, she was able to bark out orders that were loud enough for the flight attendants to actually hear what was going on, and they were instructed to get up and walk down the aisles and make sure the passengers are okay. And this is when the crew spotted Jennifer. They acted quickly and rushed over and they grabbed Holly and the girl next to her and they safely got them out of that row and moved them to a different row. And then once they were gone, two men named Andrew and Tim, they volunteered to go in row 14 and pull Jennifer back into the plane. They knew the risks. They pull her in, there is still an opening in this plane and they could very easily just get sucked out themselves. But they didn't care. They knew they needed to help this woman. And so without any hesitation, the two men walked into row 14. They got in position and with all their might, they were able to pull Jennifer in. They got her into the aisle and then the two men were able to leave row 14 without being sucked out. And so Jennifer is laying in the aisle and a passenger who happened to be a nurse who was named Peggy, she rushed over and she began performing CPR. At this point, Holly remembers looking around the cabin and seeing that everybody was just perfectly still. It was still deafeningly loud inside of the cabin because this window is still sucking air out. So it's very, very loud, but she's looking out and there was just this aura of calm inside the plane. No one was running around. No one was panicking. Everyone was just kind of sitting, watching as Peggy was trying to save Jennifer's life. At 11:21 a.m., so 17 minutes after that pop was heard outside of the plane, the captain of this plane is able to successfully perform an emergency landing at an airport in Philadelphia. And as soon as they touched down on the runway, the captain had already coordinated with a medical team who was standing by, and they rushed on, they grabbed Jennifer, they rushed her out, they got her to the hospital, but unfortunately she didn't make it. She died from blunt force trauma from having been forced out of that window. It was just too small, and it happened too suddenly, and it killed her. Holly was obviously very shaken up by this experience, just like the rest of the passengers who were on board. But there's a detail in Holly's story that makes her experience even more traumatic. On the morning she got on this plane, she arrived at the airport fairly early. She had a big coffee with her and she got in line for security. So as she's going through this line, she's drinking this huge coffee. And then when it's her turn to actually go through the scanners, she finishes this coffee, she throws it away, she goes through security. And by the time she's on the other side, she's now late. And so she runs all the way to her gate, and when she boards, her boarding group has already gotten on. And so all the seats that she liked to take, those are already gone. She liked to sit towards the front of the plane because she liked to be one of the people that got off the plane first once they landed. And so she began looking for the first open row that she could sit in. And so she starts walking down the row and she finally gets to row 14. She's looking on her left and there's a totally open row, 3 open seats. And so, like she always did on long flights, she took the window seat, seat 14A, because she could lean her head up against the side of the plane and sleep. And so after she buckled herself in and put her luggage underneath the seat in front of her, she remembered she had just drank that huge cup of coffee while she was going through security. And even though she didn't have to go to the bathroom right then, she expected to probably have to go a couple of times once they took off. And so not wanting to disrupt the two people that were inevitably going to take the two seats next to her by constantly all flight long getting up and sneaking past them to go to the bathroom over and over again, Holly decides, you know what, I'll just move. I will sit in the aisle seat. It's not as good because I can't sleep, but at least this way I can get up and use the bathroom without disrupting the people I'm sitting near. And so she unbuckles herself, she reaches down, she grabs her bag from underneath the chair in front of her, she stands up and she moves 2 seats over to the aisle seat of row 14. She sits down, she puts her seatbelt on, she puts her luggage under the seat in front of her there, and then as she's kind of getting herself situated, she sees someone has stopped right outside of row 14. And so she turns, and looking down at her is the smiling face of Jennifer Reardon. And she says, hi, is anybody sitting next to you? Can I sit next to you? And Holly says, absolutely. And Jennifer sneaks past her and sits in the window seat. The next and final story of today's episode is called Legendary Lifeguard. On June 25th, 1950, the Korean War broke out between the North Koreans and the South Koreans. Just 2 days after this war had begun, the United States formally entered the conflict by sending troops to aid the South Koreans. Shortly after this, the United States enacted a military draft. A military draft is the forced enlistment of civilians into the military. In the Korean War, the way Americans were chosen was in a lottery, and if their name was called, they would have to stop whatever they were doing in the civilian world and immediately go serve their country. And if they refused, they would go to jail. An 18-year-old high school dropout nicknamed Samson was living with his family in Seattle, Washington when he found out he had been drafted. While military service was not something Samson was considering for his future, he accepted his fate with grace, and before long, he was making his way to Fort Ord in Northern California to begin his military training. But after training, when Samson was now officially a soldier in the army, he was not sent to Korea to fight in the war. Instead, he was ordered to stay at Fort Ord and be the lifeguard for their pool. It's unclear how Samson felt about this, but regardless, he did his duty, and he stayed at this pool and he minded the folks who went swimming, and then at night and on the weekends, he would earn some extra cash by being a bouncer at a local bar. A year later, Samson was still working at the Fort Ord pool when he decided to take some time off and go back home to Seattle and see his family and see his girlfriend. As a military member, Samson was able to fly for free on any military flight so long as he was in uniform. And so Samson packed up his things, he threw on his uniform, and he made his way over to the Fort Ord airport, where he hopped on a small military plane and he flew to Seattle. A few days later, on September 30th, 1951, Samson said goodbye to his family and to his girlfriend, and then he put his uniform back on and made his way to the Seattle airport. When he got there, he saw there was only one military plane that was flying from Seattle all the way down to Fort Ord. And this plane was a World War II era dive bomber that only had enough space for one person, the pilot. Samson had to get back to Fort Ord that night because the following day he had work, and in the army you can't just not show up for work. But Samson didn't have enough money to buy a civilian plane ticket to take a civilian flight down to Fort Ord. So he was in a tough spot. And so he approaches this pilot of this dive bomber plane, and he says, hey, can I just cram into your radar compartment in the back of your plane? And the pilot, whose name was Anderson, immediately said, no, that's a terrible idea. It's not meant for passengers. It's barely big enough to fit inside of. You could get badly hurt in there. But Samson was adamant that he had to get back that night, that he'd be in so much trouble if he didn't. And he kind of appealed to Anderson and said, look, you're in the military. You get it. I have to get back there tonight. Can you please make an exception and just let me hitch a ride in the back of your plane? And so finally, against his better judgment, Anderson caves and he says, okay, Samson, you can come with me. And so a little bit before 4 p.m. that afternoon, Samson eagerly went around to the side of the plane. He opened up a side hatch and he crawled inside of this very tight radar compartment. And once he was tucked up inside, Anderson walked around and he closed the hatch behind him. And then Anderson got in the cockpit and began preparing the plane for takeoff. A few minutes later, the pair was careening down the runway, and right as the plane began to experience lift and was going up into the air, the side hatch of the radar compartment where Samson was suddenly flew open. The big issue with this now open door in the radar compartment was not that Samson, like in the movies, would get sucked out this door out to his death, although if he wasn't careful, he totally could fall out of the door. No, the real problem with this now open door had to do with oxygen levels. At their cruising altitude, where the majority of their flight would be spent, there wasn't enough oxygen in the air to sustain human life. And so as soon as Anderson powered up that plane and began preparing it for takeoff, he began pumping oxygen into the cockpit and also into the radar compartment space. This is done specifically to compensate for the lack of oxygen up at that cruising altitude. But with Sampson's door now wide open, all that extra oxygen that was coming into that space to keep him alive is now just being sucked right out the door into the atmosphere, which meant if Sampson couldn't find a way to shut that door, he would eventually pass out and suffocate to death. Sampson, who was fully aware of this fact, immediately jumped into action by anchoring his feet and legs around the stanchion in the middle of this compartment space, and once he was fairly secure, he began extending his upper body out of the plane to try to grab onto the handle to try to shut it. But once he was holding onto that door handle, he's now halfway out of the plane, he could not get it to shut. The wind was so strong it was pinning the door open. And so for the next several minutes, Sampson desperately is trying to get this door shut, but it's not working. And so eventually he retreated back into the plane and went all the way to the very back of the radar compartment space and tucked himself up behind some equipment. Because this was not an area where passengers were supposed to be, there was no way to communicate with the pilot. He could not tell Anderson that he was dying back here. And so he just sat there and prayed. While Sampson was dealing with this open door crisis, Anderson was dealing with a crisis of his own. At some point after takeoff, he looked down at his gauges and he realized a terrible mistake had been made. There wasn't enough fuel to get to Fort Ord, and where he was discovering it, where he was out over the water, there wasn't enough fuel to even turn around and go back to Seattle. And so Anderson grabs his radio and he tries to call out to these surrounding airports to see if there's anywhere he can just emergency land this plane, but all he hears is silence. It would turn out his radio equipment just happened to fail right at this moment. And what also happened to fail right at that moment was Anderson's oxygen supply. It had nothing to do with Sampson and the open door. Anderson just also suddenly was without oxygen. And so Anderson knew he had to get to a lower altitude as fast as possible because he would eventually pass out and crash the plane. And so he went into a very steep dive and began going down and realized he needed to try to land this plane in the ocean now. There was no way he could get to an airport. And so he's burning down towards the water, and as they're coming down in altitude, there was more oxygen in the air. And so Sampson, who had eventually passed out from a lack of oxygen, is suddenly revived with all this additional oxygen as they're going down. And so Sampson comes to and he looks and the door is still wide open, and all he can see is the Pacific Ocean burning up at him. He only had a few seconds to grab onto the stanchion in the middle of the space he's in before they impacted the water. Miraculously, Sampson survived the impact, but immediately he was faced with another life and death situation. Because this door was wide open, the freezing cold water began pouring inside, flooding the space. And so Sampson tried to swim his way out, but the power of this water coming in was too strong, and so he had to wait until the space completely flooded before he swam out and then swam up to the surface. Once he got to the surface, he's looking around and the water's incredibly choppy and it's very foggy. He can barely see anything. He's looking around for Anderson, not really sure what happened to him, and he looks down the plane towards the front of the plane and he sees Anderson climbing out of the cockpit. He looks badly beaten up, but he's alive. He's okay. And so Sampson yells to him and the two men link up and they're able to pull two life rafts out of the plane. And so both men, they get into each of their rafts right as this plane sinks down below the surface. And so Anderson and Sampson begin looking around, wondering what they're going to do, but it's so foggy, they can't see land in any direction. They can barely see 10 feet away from themselves. And so Anderson thought they landed maybe 2 or 3 miles off the coast of California, but they weren't really sure. So Anderson pulled out his compass, he looked east and said, let's just start paddling. The men had crashed about 2 miles off the coast of Point Reyes, California, which is this big protected shoreline that's about 150 miles north of Fort Ord. And this particular stretch of water that these two men had found themselves in was a known breeding ground for great white sharks. So the two men, they got their compass and they're trying to swim as fast as they can to the east, but they're not seeing any land. The fog hasn't let up at all. And then eventually it got dark. and as soon as it got dark, the water got choppier and choppier until at one point, Samson actually was launched out of his raft into the water. He turned around and saw his raft, but it was being pulled away by a current faster than he could swim to it. And so Samson yells out for Anderson, who sees him in the water. Anderson tries his best to paddle over and save Samson, but the current was too strong, and before long, Samson watched as Anderson just disappeared into the fog. Now, Samson was all alone in the middle of the night. He couldn't see anything. There's no land anywhere. He doesn't have the compass. Anderson had the compass, so he has no idea which direction is what. He's in a shark breeding ground, and now he doesn't have his life raft. And so Samson did the only thing he could do, which was pick a direction that he believed was east and start swimming. And so Samson is swimming in this pitch black water. He can't see anything around him. And all he's probably thinking about is how any minute now, I'm going to run out of energy and I'm going to sink down and I'm going to drown, or I'm going to get attacked by sharks, or some combination of the two. But miraculously, after about an hour of swimming in some direction, he broke through the fog and he saw way off in the distance was a light on what looked like dry land. And so he has this sudden burst of energy and he swims as hard and as fast as he possibly can. A couple of times he gets pulled under by rip currents and he nearly drowns, but eventually he gets to the sandy shores of Point Reyes. It's believed he swam approximately 1 or 2 miles after being dumped out of the boat. As he was pulling himself out of the water and collapsed on the beach, he had given everything to that swim. Had he been in the water for even a few more minutes, it's very likely he would have drowned. Unable to stand from pure exhaustion, Samson just began slowly crawling up the beach towards this light he had seen as he was swimming. And it would turn out this light was on the outside of this building that was owned by a radio station. And so Samson is crawling and periodically puking out seawater. And finally, after about 30 or 45 minutes, he gets to the steps of this building. He crawls up the steps and he pounds on the door. And by this point, he's hypothermic, he's in shock. He's about to die if he doesn't get any help. And luckily, there's someone inside of this building. They open it up, they see Samson. They don't know what's going on, but they pick him up, they pull him inside, they wrap him in a blanket, and they try to ask him, what happened? What's going on? Why are you here? But Samson was too cold to even speak, so he just sat there and shook. And so finally, this employee just called the Coast Guard that had a station very close to where they were. And a few minutes later, the Coast Guard shows up, they take Samson, and they rush him to their station house where they were able to give him medical treatment, which saved his life. It was also at this Coast Guard station where Samson was reunited with Anderson, who had also managed to make his way to shore alive. Samson would go on to serve for 2 more years in the Army. The entire time was spent as a lifeguard at the Fort Ord pool. Then in 1953, after the Korean War ended, Samson's mandatory service came to an end and he was honorably discharged. Samson would go on to become one of the most successful and well-known actors and producers of all time. He has won hundreds of big awards, including 4 Academy Awards and 4 Golden Globe Awards. Samson's real name is Clint Eastwood. Thank you for listening to the Mrballen podcast. If you got something out of this episode and you haven't done this already, please ask the 5-star review button to hold your very easily startled cat, and then once they do, press the test button on your smoke detector. Also, please subscribe to the Mrballen podcast on YouTube, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Amazon, Google, and anywhere else you get your podcasts. This podcast airs every Monday and Thursday morning, but in the meantime, you can always watch one of the hundreds of stories we have posted on our main YouTube channel, which is just called Mrballen. We now have a registered 501c3 charitable organization called the Mrballen Foundation that makes it as easy as possible for you to join me, my family, and my team in supporting those whose lives have been most impacted